Shalom everyone, hope everyone's doing well. As Hashem, today we are starting towards the bottom of Yutet Amud Bet 19b, which is at the words in the Gemara. It's about 6-7 lines from the bottom of the page, Yutet Amud Bet. We're going to learn Chaf Amud Aleph today, and we're going to begin at Ktiv Palti v'Ktiv Palti El. That's where we left off yesterday. We're going to have 3 sections in today's learning. The first section is going to be a discussion, very interesting topic, which really follows where we left off yesterday regarding this fellow. His name was Paltiel, that Michal was given to instead of David. We'll speak about that and some related aggadita. The second section is the Mishnah in Chaf Amud Aleph, which discusses the ceremonies around death when there's a king involved as the relative. And then the third section will be the Gemara that talks about the setup of women in general around the coffin. Very interesting machloket and how it ties into the story of David and Avner. Bezat Hashem will speak about it. So let's just remember, before we continue, our learning should be as a zechut, as a merit for refuah shleima, speedy, full, and complete recovery for Yaakov ben Dinah. And Bezat Hashem, we should only hear b'sarot tovot. But let's just remember where we're holding here. We're holding in the middle of a sugya where we were discussing yesterday this story with David and these 2 women, Michal and Meirav. So what happened? David HaMelech killed Goliath, who was this giant, and he was promised that he'd be allowed to marry the daughter of the king. Now initially that was meant to be Meirav, but as we spoke out yesterday, there was a mistake the way he performed her kiddushin, and he wasn't married to her. At least according to one shita. It was machloket yesterday, I should say. Meaning really it was a machloket. The other shita said that he married her and then she died and then he married Michal. But either way, regarding that second marriage, Michal, that was after he supposedly did kiddushin to her. There was a discrepancy between David and Shaul as to if they were married. Shaul held that they were not, and he gave this Michal to be married to a fellow whose name was Palti ben Laish, we'll speak about today. And as we'll see, this fellow, Palti ben Laish, never had relations with her because he knew that she was really an eshet ish to David, and the Gemara is going to say he was a tremendous tzaddik. So let's see this inside. The Gemara says like this: there seems to be a contradiction, because Ketiv in Shmuel Aleph, it calls this fellow who Michal was given to Palti. Ketiv in Shmuel Bet, it calls him Paltiel, so it's a different name. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Palti Shmo, his name was Palti. V'lama nekra Shmo Paltiel. Why was he called Paltiel? And Palti, like liflot, means to push away. Shepaltu kel min ha'avera, because Hashem pushed him away from Avera. Means HaKadosh Baruch Hu helped prevent him from sinning. Because as we're going to see, he understood that Michal was really an eshet ish. She was really married to David HaMelech. And yet, he didn't have relations with her all of those days that he was together with her. Ma'asa, what did Paltiel do? Na'atz cherev beino lebeina. He stuck a sword between him and her, means Palti and Michal. And Amar, he said, Kol ha'osek b'davar zeh, anybody that's involved in this, meaning anybody that has relations like this, which would be asur, yidaker b'cherev zeh, should be stabbed with this sword. So he made a physical reminder, demarcation, so as to show this is prohibited, I can't have relations with her. Says the Gemara, v'hachtiv, but the pasuk seems to imply that they were married, because it says after David takes her back rightfully, it says vayelech ita isha. Her husband went with her. Now her husband, that's a word that's used if someone had relations with her, actually married her in the real sense. So you see, it seems like he did marry her and have relations with her. So the Gemara answers, Shenaseh la ki isha. No, it means he cared for her. A very interesting Rashi. He says over here, Shaya migadla umechabeva. He raised her and he cared for her like her husband, but he never actually had relations with her, which makes his gadlut even greater. It means he genuinely cared for her, but he made sure not to have relations. But the pasuk seems to imply that he did, because it says halachu uvoche. It says that when David took her back, this Palti was going and crying after her, which implies that he really was her husband and they had indeed had relations. So the Gemara answers, unbelievable. The Gemara answers is, why was he crying? Not because he was sad to see her go, because he wanted to continue to live with her, but the opposite, not because he wanted to for his own desires, but ala mitzvah da azil minei. He was crying because of the mitzvah that he was about to lose. Meaning to say is, until now, he was kovesh et yitzro. He conquered his yetzer and he prevented himself from having relations with her, which is a tremendous gadlut. That's a huge mitzvah that he was doing. Now that he was losing that opportunity, that was something that he was crying about. This is an incredible feat we're talking about here. And it says he cried ad bachurim, until this place called bachurim. But the Gemara expounds, bachurim means young men. What does it mean? Shena'asu shnehem ke bachurim shelo ta'amu tam biyah. That both Michal and this Palti were like young men that had not had the taste of biyah, meaning is that they remained pure despite having the opportunity to have relations with each other, because Palti was such a gibor, he was such a koveshet yitzro, he conquered his yetzer hara so much. The Gemara comments on this note. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Tokvo shel Yosef, the might of Yosef. Rashi says Tokvo connotes something that is very powerful and well known. So the greatness of Yosef that we know about, where he avoided having relations with the wife of Potiphar, which was a tremendous feat of personal control, in Vatunato shel Boaz, is considered something small in regards to what Boaz did. We're going to see momentarily what the story was with Boaz, but he had an opportunity to have relations, we'll see in the story in Ruth, with a woman he could have perhaps had relations with, and he refrained. This was with Ruth. Tokvo shel Boaz, and yet the greatness of that in Vatunoto shel Palti was considered something small regards to what Palti ben Laish was able to accomplish. So as to say is that Yosef did a tremendous thing in overcoming his yetzer hara with the wife of Potiphar, but that's considered small, not significant regarding to what Boaz was able to do. Boaz was much greater. And what Boaz did was something small in regards to what Palti ben Laish was able to overcome. Where do we find this? Tokvo shel Yosef in Vatunoto shel Boaz. How do we know that what Yosef's feat was not considered as great as that of Boaz? Because it says, in Megillat Ruth, it says, what does this refer to? It says in the Pasuk, Boaz woke up in the middle of the night, and not to get into the entire story there, but Ruth had apparently gone to his bed in the middle of the night, and it says he was scared, vayilafet, and it says yilafet. So my vayilafet, what does that refer to? Amar Rav, so Rav explained, Shena'aseh b'saro kiroshe liftot, that Boaz's, literally means his flesh, became hardened like the tips of turnips. Meaning is that he actually was aroused, recognizing there was a woman in his bed. So Rashi explains over here, he had an opportunity to have relations with Ruth, but he said, no, we have to do this in the permissible way. And he didn't have relations with her in the prohibited way. Why was that considered greater than the actions of Yosef? Because Yosef had Eshet Potiphar, she was married and she had a husband. So there was a distance, she wasn't in his bed. Whereas by Boaz, this woman, Ruth, was actually a pnuya, she was permitted to him, she was not married, and she was actually in his bed. So there's a greatness there associated with Boaz overcoming that natural inclination to have relations with her, despite being aroused by her, as the pasuk implies, like we said, and he overcame that. That's considered even greater than that of Yosef. 1 second. Yeah. Amazing. And the Gemara continues and tells us, moving to Chaf Amud Aleph, Tokvo shel Boaz an vitanuto shel Palti ben Laish. The greatness of Yosef, of Boaz, was considered small in regards to Palti ben Laish, Kedamar, like we explained. Meaning to say is that Palti ben Laish was living with Michal. Michal, officially she was his wife. And yet, for many years, he was able to overcome his yetzer hara. It wasn't a one-time thing. So that is an even greater level than that of Boaz, and certainly that of Yosef. What's fascinating to note here, and I'm not going to give a shot, we have to think about this a little bit, is that commonly we think about Yosef as the greatest gibor. Actually, there's the Gemara, if I remember correctly, in Yoma, that tells us, actually it's talking about beauty, but it highlights the fact that he was the one who was koveshet yitzro. It's a fascinating thing, because it seems to be from this sugya that the greatness of one who's koveshet yitzro is even more highlighted with Boaz, with Palti ben Laish, even more than that of Yosef. Something to think about, which is fascinating. Let's continue. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my dichtiv, what does it mean in Mishlei? The pasuk tells, we say this every Friday night with Heshet Chayil. We say, Rabot banot asu chayil, many girls have done valiant work, va'at alit al kulana, and you are greater than all of them. So we reference in this context the valiant effort of these three great people that we just spoke about. Rabot banot asu chayil, many girls have done valiant effort. Ze Yosef u Boaz, it refers to Yosef and Boaz, that they were able to overcome the Yetzer Hara in a tremendous way beyond the norm. Va'ata lital kulana, but you were greater than the rest of them. Ze Palti ben Laish, this refers to Palti ben Laish, as we explained, his efforts of overcoming his Yetzer were even considered more great. What does it mean? And also in that context in Mishlei, in that chapter, we also say in Eshet Chayil, Sheker achen vehevel hayofi. So I have a series of pshatim what this refers to. Sheker achen, that the grace is a false, and hevel is the yofi, the beauty is nothing, is vain. So what does it refer to? Sheker achen ze Yosef. Sheker achen refers to Yosef, meaning what he was able to overcome. He disregarded the temptation. Refers to Yosef HaTzadik. Vehevel hayofi, how this refers to Ze Boaz. This refers to Boaz. Again, how he was able to overcome the beauty of Ruth and not have relations with her. Yirat Hashem iti talal. Praised is the one that has Yirat Hashem, fear of Hashem. Ze Palti ben Laish. This refers to Palti ben Laish because he was considered the most elevated, how he was able to overcome his Yetzer in the greatest way. Davar acher, another pshat. Sheker achen ze doro shel Moshe. The first part of the pasuk, Sheker achen, refers to not greatness in overcoming Yetzer, but greatness in Torah. Sheker achen refers to the generation of Moshe. Rashi says that they learned tremendous amounts of Torah. Ve'hevel hayofi zeh doro shel Yoshua, and Hevel hayofi refers to Yoshua ben Nun. His generation is Hevel hayofi. They also learned tremendous amounts of Torah. But Yirat Hashem hiti talal, the greatest thing is Yirat Hashem zeh doro shel Chizkiah. Rashi explains something fascinating, is that in the generation of Chizkiah, he pushed Torah so much until you couldn't find one Amma Aretz from Dan ad Be'er Sheva. So the way they were osek in Torah in his generation even superseded that of Moshe and Yoshua's generations. Davar acher, another explanation, and this sort of is on top of the previous one. Sheker achen ze doro shel Moshe v'Yoshua. It refers to the generation of Moshe and Yoshua in their greatness of Torah. Vehevel hayofi ze doro shel Chizkiah. This refers to the generation of Chizkiah. Yirat Hashem iti talal ze doro shel Yehuda bar Rabbi Eloi. It refers to the generation of the great Tanner of Yehuda bar Rabbi Eloi. Amar alav of Yehuda bar Rabbi Eloi shayu shisha talmidim mitkasin b'talis achat. They were so poor that 6 students had to cover themselves in one garment. V'oskin b'Torah. But yet they studied Torah because of the passion, the esek that they were involved in Torah. So his generation even superseded, in terms of their limud Torah, how they were osek in Torah, that of Moshe, Yoshua, and of Chizkiah. Let's move on now to the next Mishnah. Now we had discussed in the previous Mishnah different halachot regarding the Kohen Gadol and the king, and now we're going to discuss, like we discussed in the previous Mishnah, how the Kohen Gadol is involved with death of a relative. Now we discuss the halachot of a king in a similar topic. So the Mishnah tells us, met lo met, if the king has a relative who passes away, and oyotzemi petach platrin shalo, the Tanakama of the Mishnah says, he does not leave his palace, means it wouldn't be appropriate for him to follow after the coffin, and therefore he stays in his palace. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, in Rotzeh latzeit achar mita yotzeh. Rabbi Yehuda, who also argued in the previous Mishnah, he said if he wants to follow after the coffin, he is allowed to. Now with him, he doesn't have an issue of tum'ah like the Kohen Gadol, so this is a different point. Shekein matzinu b'David, and he says we find this by David HaMelech. Sheyatza achar mitato shel Avner. We find that there's a story in Shmuel, which says, Shmuel Bet, which says as follows. Let me just speak out the story because we're going to have to know it for the next Gemara. The story was as follows. We know the first king was Shaul HaMelech, but Shaul HaMelech did certain things that were inappropriate in the eyes of Hashem, and therefore he needed to pass away, and David was meant to take over. Shaul passed away, and after he passed away, there was a discrepancy as to who should take over. So the Navi said David was supposed to take over, but Avner, who was the officer of Shaul, appointed Shaul's son, whose name was Ishboshet, as the king. Now we're going to see in the Gemara, it was 2.5 years that there was this issue where Ishboshet was in power, and then eventually David took over as the king of the entire United Nation after. But the point is, this Avner initially followed Ishboshet, he put him into power, and after he left this Ishboshet, Ayin Sham, see the story in Shmuel Bet to understand the whole story, and he went and he made a pact with David that he would end up supporting him and the nation would be united. Now, David had an officer, his name was Yoav, the head of his officers, and he didn't appreciate this pact for whatever reason, and he went and he killed Avner. This is after David had made a pact with Avner. So what happened was, Avner was killed, and this was a terrible thing, because now the people who supported Avner thought David had orchestrated him being killed. So he sort of seduced Avner into making a pact so he'd be vulnerable, and then he sent his guy, Yoav, to kill Avner. So in order that the people would know and not rebel against him, create like a third, a new column in the Jewish people, David followed after the kever, the coffin of Avner, to show he had no involvement in this, and actually he was upset about his death. He didn't want Yoav to kill him. Yoav was eventually punished for this. But that's why I say the Chachamim, why he was following after. And the Mefarshim speak out, actually, is that Rabbi Yehuda's proof is based on the assumption, how do we know that a king could follow after a relative? Because since Avner was such a Talmid Chacham, he was such a great Torah scholar, everyone's considered his relative, the Gemara tells us elsewhere, so that's Rabbi Yehuda's proof. But the Chachamim say back, no. The reason he followed after is not because normally a king is allowed to, but it was to show the people, to appease them, that he had no ill will towards Avner, and this was not his doing. But really a king cannot follow after his relative. Let's see that inside. So Amruleh, they said back to Rabbi Yehuda, Lo haya davar. Sorry, let's just go back. Shenemar v'amelch David alach holech achar hamita. So Rabbi Yehuda's proof is, you see that David followed after Avner's coffin. He's like a relative, so you see he could. So Amruleh, they said back to Rabbi Yehuda, Lo haya davar el lefayis et ha'am. That was only to appease the people, so that they know he didn't have any ill intent against Avner. Continues the Mishnah, and when they used to give the king the first meal, we spoke about it before, after the burial, the mourners were fed a meal from the other people, the donations of the other people. So when the king was fed this first meal, the whole nation would sit on the earth, and the king would sit on a dargish. We'll see in the Gemara what a dargish is, but it's something seemingly more significant than what the Kohen Gadol used to sit on, which we said in the Gemara, in the Mishnah before. We said he would sit on a safsal. Was that the word we used? On a bench. So we'll see exactly what it is in the Gemara, but the point is the king sat in a more elevated place and the people sat on the ground. Tanu Rabbanan says the Braita. Moving on to the third and final section of the day. Now, there is a machloket, which is where, when you're walking with the coffin, should the women stand? In the front of the coffin or behind the coffin? So Tanu Rabbanan, the Braita says, Makom shenagu nashim latzeit achar hamita. If the custom is that the women follow behind the coffin, yotzot, that's okay. Lifnei hamita, in front of the coffin, yotzot, means whatever the custom is, it's acceptable. This is the Tanakama. Tosafot quotes a very interesting understanding of this. He says like this: the issue with them going in front would be that people who walk behind them would be looking at them inappropriately, and that could lead to hirhur. However, since it's at a time of tsar, of suffering, someone's passed away, we're not worried about inappropriate thoughts. But in the Yerushalmi, the Gemara explains over there that there's two sides of this issue. Some say, as we just said, it's better for them to go in the back because if they go in front, it'll create hirhur. So some say they can go in the front, because we're not worried about hirhur. And the Yerushalmi elaborates and says, why is it ideal for them to go in the front? Because since Chava ultimately brought death to this world, in the beginning death was caused because of the woman, so therefore they go in front as if to symbolize that. And others say they should go in the back and the men should go in the front because it would be disgraceful for men to be looking at Jewish girls. It means even if it's not a hirhur issue necessarily, it's just disgraceful that the men should be looking at Jewish girls. So therefore, we have such a debate, but the first opinion in the Braita says either minhag is acceptable. Rabbi Yehuda argues, he says, Lo'olam nashim lifnei hamita yotzot. He says, no, the women always go in the front. How do we know this? Shekein matzinu b'David, because we find regarding David HaMelech, sheyatza achar mitato shel Avner. David, it says in the pasuk, followed behind the coffin. Now he wouldn't go l'chaora amongst the women, so it must be the women were in the front, David was in the back. So v'haraya, says Rabbi Yehuda in this Braita, that the women went in the front. Like the pasuk says, V'amelech David holech achar hamita. It says he went after the mita, after the coffin of Avner. So Amr Lo, the Chachamim said back to Rabbi Yehuda, Lo Haya Davar, the only reason he followed after the coffin, as we said in the Mishnah, we don't even hold he should have gone out in the first place. He only went El Lefayes et Ha'am Baisu in order to appease the people, and they were appeased. They understood that the fact that he's going amongst them for the delegation to bury Avner, obviously he didn't have ill will against Avner. Shaya David Yotzemi Ben Anashim Nichnas LeBein Anashim. It could be that the women were in the back. David went from the men and entered amongst the women to appease them. V'yatzami Ben Anashim Nichnas LeBein Anashim. And then he went back to the men in order to appease them. Means he was constantly going back and forth so as to show everybody, I didn't have any ill will towards Avner, which was true. Shene'emar, the pasuk says, "Vayid'u kol ha'am v'chol Yisrael." All the people knew, "Ki lo hayta me'amelech la'amit et Avner," that David did not intend to kill Avner. So therefore, the Chachamim say it could be the women were in the back. Really, David was in the back. Yeah, he went back and forth because he wanted to show both men and women that he had no ill will towards Avner. Now let's continue on with the story. Darash Rav expounded. What does it mean when it says in the pasuk, "Vayavo kol ha'am lahavrot et David"? So there's a discrepancy here between the way it's written and the way it's pronounced. It says the people came to give David his first meal, which like a mourner. He was like a mourner for Avner. So Ktiv, the pasuk actually writes lahachrot, meaning actually the way it's written, it should be with a chaf. Very interesting. I see on the side here the Ein Mishpat doesn't know where this comes from. But it could be read that way at least. 1 second. I mean, they point out there's actually an issue. Usually when it says such a language like this is the Krik Tiv. I mean, there's the way it's written, the way it's pronounced. But here actually it is Lahavrot. But either way, it's written Lahachrot, as if to cut down David. And we read it as if they came to feed him, to comfort him, to make him feel better. So what's the pshat? Initially, they came to cut him down, means they thought he was a bad guy because he had instructed Avner to be killed, and therefore they came to cause him harm. And afterwards, when they recognized that he had no ill will, only good intention toward Avner, and it was Yoav who went on his own to do this, they fed him, they comforted him. Amar of Yudah Marab, if they mana enash Avner, why was Avner indeed punished that he was killed like this? What sin had he done? So the first answer, the Gemara says, Shaul had commanded that the city of Nov, Ira Kohanim, a city of Kohanim, was to be destroyed because he looked at it as if they supported his enemy, David HaMelech. Now, Avner had an opportunity as the right-hand man of Shaul to protest. He didn't, and he should have, and therefore he was killed now in this story with Yoav. Rabbi Yitzchak Amar, Micha velo ne'aneh. Rabbi Yitzchak says that's not true. Actually, Avner protested, and Shaul didn't listen to him. Now both of these shitot, Rabbi Yudah Marav and Rabbi Yitzchak, whether he didn't protest or he did and he wasn't heeded, are both deduced from the same verse, because it says after the death of Avner, it says, Vayekonena melech el Avner, the king cried out about Avner, he lamented, Vayomer, and he said, Akimot naval yamut Avner, like a lowly person should Avner die, Yadecha lo asurot, your hands were not bound, Raglecha lo lenechushtayim hugashu, and your feet in chains were not held together. So how do you read this pasuk? There's two ways to look at it. Manda Amar Lo Micha, according to Rav Yudah Marav, says that he did not protest, which was his cause of death. Achika Amar, this is the pshat in the pasuk. Yadecha lo asirot v'ragacha lo nechushtayim hugashu. Your hands and feet were not tied, meaning Shaul held you in a very high esteem. You could have protested. If you would have said something, you wouldn't have been withheld, means he would have listened to what you said. My time alo machita, so why didn't you protest? Therefore, kinfol ifnei bnei avla nafalta, like someone who falls in front of the wicked people, you fell, meaning you were deserving of your punishment because you didn't protest. Umandam Rabbi Yitzchak, who learns micha velo ne'aneh, that he protested and he wasn't heeded, so he learns itmuya mitame, that David was saying this in wonder, he couldn't understand, which was hakemot naval yamut, should like a lowly person Avner have died. Yadecha lo asirot v'raglecha lo nechushtayim. Your hands were not bound, your feet were not connected. Michti means what he was saying was, let's analyze this. Mechuya machita, I know you protested. So meaning you didn't withhold back. Your hands were not, you did protest. So my time can fall if bnei avla nafalti. Couldn't understand then why is it that you died? Means if you learn like that, Shita Rabbi Yitzchak, so he was saying in wonder, I can't believe it. So So the Gemara says, okay, but if that's true, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, that Avner did protest, he tried. So why was he punished that he was killed by Yoav? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, sheshahem malchut beit David shtei shanim umechza. He was punished because seemingly against the Navi, he appointed this Ishboshet into power, even though David should have been the one who took power. And he delayed the Malchut of David over the entire Jewish people when he was eventually appointed by 2.5 years, because as Rashi explains the Cheshbon here, is that Ishboshet ruled for 2 years. And then there was a half a year that it took for them to appoint David. So therefore, there were 2.5 years that David should have been the reigning king over all of the Jews. But because Avner appointed Ishboshet, he delayed that. That was considered inappropriate, and that's why he was punished, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu caused Yoav to kill him. We're going to stop here, the 2 dots towards the bottom of Chaf Amud Aleph. Start the Hashem will pick up tomorrow with Chaf Amud Aleph at the bottom. We'll do Chaf Amud Bet. In the meantime, I wish everybody a wonderful day.